The night I caught her changed everything. What started as suspicion turned into a twisted game of betrayal, deception, and revenge. But trust me, the way this all ends, you won't see it coming. I'm truly grateful that karma exists, and after a fierce struggle she finally understood its weight. In the end, the victor claimed all her affections. And that victor was me. I, Eddie Hansen, eventually received an invitation to her apartment, where, over dinner, she made a declaration that changed everything. I was her chosen one. The battle for her heart had been an intense one, fought between Elliot Robertson and me. Before Linda made her decision, the rivalry between us had been relentless. Elliot and I came from rival clubs but ended up on the same football team when our local squad was promoted to the first division. We both excelled in the sport, quickly becoming recognized stars in our small Scandinavian town. As young, single men, we enjoyed the attention of local women, until Linda entered the picture. Our first encounter with Linda happened at a trendy cafe where she was working as a waitress while searching for a job as a hairdresser. From the moment we met her, both Elliot and I were drawn in, immediately trying to win her over. However, Linda refused to choose between us, and rather than giving up, we both found ourselves caught in a strange, ongoing competition. We started meeting regularly, the three of us, which in hindsight was a ridiculous idea, but with a woman as stunning as Linda, it seemed worth the risk. Linda had a way of keeping things balanced, ensuring that neither of us could gain the upper hand too easily. And despite the many other women we could have pursued, our rivalry over her became an obsession, one neither of us wanted to lose. But playing Linda's game wasn't easy. She seemed to relish the excitement of the chase, deliberately prolonging the competition just for the thrill of it. As time passed, I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Elliot was pulling ahead. My fears were confirmed when rumors spread that a local underground bookmaker had started taking bets on Linda's final choice. At first, it seemed amusing, but when the odds started shifting in Elliot's favor, the joke lost its charm. Elliot caught wind of the bookmaker too and suspected that someone, perhaps one of Linda's close friends, was leaking insider information. And when even Linda's best friend hinted at Elliot having an edge, he wasted no time in making his move. What followed was a chaotic scene, one that I never saw coming. At a wild party, a group of girls joined Linda on stage, turning the night into an unforgettable spectacle. Encouraged by the rowdy, intoxicated crowd, things quickly spiraled into an impromptu striptease. The electrified atmosphere, fueled by youth and reckless abandon, swept everyone away. And just when it seemed like the night couldn't get any crazier, the host of the party introduced a twist, one that would change everything. With a dramatic flourish, Elliot pulled the main fuse, plunging the entire room into darkness. "Let's have some real fun," he announced, inviting everyone to enjoy the next 15 minutes in complete darkness. The crowd, already wild with excitement, erupted in cheers, eagerly embracing the chaos. And so, that night became the most infamous party our Scandinavian city had ever seen. For most people, it was nothing more than a legendary evening, a story to be told for years to come. But for Elliot, it marked the night he lost both his bet and Linda. He felt cheated, robbed not only of his money but of Linda's supposed innocence, which in truth she had discarded long ago. Furious and humiliated, he even swore revenge on me. Elliot didn't take losing well. He was bitter, unable to accept defeat with grace. In his frustration, he initially refused to pay the bookmaker, only backing down when one of the bookmaker's associates stepped in to handle the situation. Fortunately, fate intervened. Elliot's contract was purchased by another football team, and not long after the party, he packed his bags and left town. His departure was a relief. I was finally free of the rivalry that had consumed so much of my life. Years later, I heard whispers about his marriage. I remember thinking, good for him. By that time, I had used my football earnings to build the life I had always envisioned. As the years passed, my relationship with Linda settled into its own rhythm. The excitement of our early days naturally gave way to routine, and while passion may have dulled slightly, I still believed we had a strong foundation. We were approaching our 10-year milestone together, and I understood that relationships evolve. Some changes were inevitable. Our wedding, a long-awaited event, was only 2 months away. Linda and my mother had thrown themselves into planning every last detail. They selected a breathtaking venue, hired a live orchestra, and even booked a vintage Bentley to take us to our ceremony in style. A honeymoon in Bali was already mapped out. Everything was coming together perfectly, until, suddenly, it wasn't. One night, out of nowhere, Linda refused to sleep in the same bed as me. She didn't offer a reason, nor did she argue. She simply gathered her things and left the room without an explanation. The next morning an awkward silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to ask. Summoning my courage, I finally confronted her. Can you tell me what's going on? I asked, my voice steady despite the uncertainty twisting inside me. Linda didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she answered cryptically, her voice void of emotion. We'll talk tonight. That was all she gave me. Nothing more. Later that evening, after our usual routine with the kids, dinner, bedtime stories, and the quiet moments that made family life feel so normal, I braced myself for whatever truth Linda was about to reveal. But deep down, I already had a sinking feeling that whatever she was about to say would shake the foundation we had spent the last 10 years carefully building. And I was right. I urge you, speak to everyone who attended those classes. This accusation feels like a calculated scheme, yet it lacks the cunning to shake my belief in my own innocence. I ask you to uncover the source of this misinformation because, without a doubt, it's coming from someone who holds a grudge against me or harbors jealousy over our relationship. I can't recall if she ever responded. The last thing I remember from that night was the overwhelming exhaustion that pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. And then her voice cut through the haze. You cheated on me and I plan to return the favor, she declared, her tone chillingly matter-of-fact. I'll sleep with someone else as revenge and then, only then, I'll be a faithful wife again. Do you understand what you've done? Are you really ready to call off our wedding over this? I stared at her, disbelief churning inside me. Are you saying that if I love you, I should still marry you after this? She didn't hesitate. Yes. If you truly love me, you'll marry me. If not, my friend has already offered to take your place. Her words sent a wave of nausea through me. I clenched my fist. Who is he? Does he even know me? Has he ever been to our classes? Tell me who he is, let me talk to him and I'll prove to you that he's lying. But Linda remained calm. You don't deserve my anger, she said softly. He means a lot to me, but my love for you is stronger. I just hope that you love me enough to forgive, just as I am willing to forgive you. We can't move forward if you keep clinging to this. She paused, then offered an ultimatum. If you really love me, let's take a break for a week. In that time, we can talk to everyone who attended that class. If someone confirms your suspicions, I'll let you handle the situation however you see fit before we get married. Please, Eddie, she whispered. Don't throw away 10 years of happiness. Don't cancel everything over this. For a moment, it almost sounded like a reasonable compromise. Almost. But any hope I had shattered when I glanced at the monitor. The camera feed flickered to life, displaying a view of our spare bedroom. It had been a storage space ever since we bought a new, expensive bed, and the old double bed had been pushed aside, nearly forgotten. Now I lay there staring at the screen in growing horror. Suddenly Linda entered the frame. She was completely undressed. And following right behind her, was a man wearing a rubber mask, the unmistakable face of Elvis Presley. I couldn't see who was hiding behind the mask. The disguise was cheap, ridiculous even, but that didn't make the situation any less disturbing. Linda's voice cut through the tension. Now it's your turn to be deceived. Are you satisfied? She turned back to the masked man, instructing him to lie down. As I watched through the monitor, I noticed something peculiar. She had deliberately chosen the ties she never liked. A deliberate message. Panic surged through me. I needed to act fast. While Linda ecstatically praised her lover's prowess, I fought against the restraints binding my wrists to the foot of the bed. Every muscle in my body strained as I twisted and pulled. With one final burst of strength, I managed to break free. The moment I was loose, I reached for the key ring in my left pocket. Among the various keys, my fingers found the small Swiss Army knife, a gift from a grateful client years ago. I muttered a quick thank you to fate, flipped open the blade and freed myself completely. I stormed to the door, threw it open and roared, "You're going to burn in hell." The shock on their faces was priceless. They barely had time to react before I lunged at Elvis, delivering a series of brutal punches. He staggered back, caught completely off guard, and within seconds he collapsed onto Linda. She shrieked, scrambling beneath his weight, her voice shaking with fear. "Stop. Please don't hurt him," she pleaded. But I wasn't finished. Grabbing the mask, I yanked it off, my heart pounding with fury. And then I saw him. Elliot. It was Elliot hiding beneath that ridiculous rubber mask. For a brief moment, everything clicked into place. The betrayal. The games. The underhanded schemes. It was Elliot who had sabotaged my wedding. Elliot who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for his moment to strike. Linda's screams echoed through the house, but I barely registered them. My hands balled into fists, and I fought the overwhelming urge to knock him unconscious all over again. Quickly, I searched through Elliot's belongings, finding his wallet and car keys. I flipped open his wallet and pulled out a business card. Without hesitation, I tossed the wallet onto the pile of his discarded clothes and turned to Linda. "Your lover is lying naked in a bed of roses," I spat. "Get dressed. Get him out of my house before I change my mind and teach him another lesson." She stared at me, eyes wide with terror, hands shaking as she hurriedly pulled on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. Tears streamed down her face, and she muttered desperate prayers under her breath, pleading for forgiveness from anyone who would listen. But I didn't care. Not anymore. "Elliot is all yours now, Linda," I said coldly. She let out a choked sob. "Do you even realize how much harm you've done to him?" I scoffed. "You should be more worried about what he's done to me." She knelt beside him, touching his face gently. "You should let him shower, at least clean the wounds from the roses," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not my problem," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "Get out." As she struggled to lift Elliot, she suddenly turned back to me, her expression shifting. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, a flash of anger breaking through her fear. "Elliot wants his camera and monitor back." I couldn't help but laugh. Even in her shame, she still had the audacity to make demands. "Tell him to send me an invoice," I said, stepping aside. "Now get out of my sight." And with that, I watched as Linda and Elliot, the two people who had shattered my trust, stumbled out of my house, leaving behind nothing but broken memories and the faint scent of betrayal. Without hesitation, I grabbed a hammer, rushed into the spare room, and smashed Elliot's camera and tripod into pieces. The sound of shattering glass and splintering plastic filled the air, but I didn't stop there. I stormed into the bedroom, raised the hammer again, and brought it down hard on the monitor, reducing it to a pile of broken shards and twisted wires. Once I was done, I gathered the wreckage, hauled it outside, and tossed the ruined equipment into the back seat of Elliot's car. It was a fitting end to the tools he had used to humiliate me. With that taken care of, I turned my attention to the next task, cleaning up the mess Linda had made both in my home and in my life. I wasted no time in reaching out to her mother, who was completely blindsided by what I had to say. As calmly as I could, I explained that her daughter had expected another man, her so-called lover, to take my place at the wedding. The only problem? He was still married, and his divorce wouldn't be finalized for another 6 months. The look of shock on her mother's face told me everything I needed to know. Linda hadn't even told her family the full extent of her betrayal. It was a brutal day for me, but I couldn't afford to dwell on the emotions crashing inside me. There was work to do. I called 6 of my closest friends, explaining the situation. Thankfully, 4 of them were able to come right away, and one even made a quick trip to the supermarket to grab a pack of cardboard boxes. Their wives also joined in, helping to pack up Linda's things so I could remove every last trace of her from my home. As we worked, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened over the weekend. Later that evening, I confided in Marie, a trusted family friend, laying out the full story without holding anything back. She was speechless at first, clearly struggling to process the sheer insanity of it all. After a long silence, she finally asked me about my current living situation. I admitted that, for now, my friends had been generous enough to let me crash in their spare bedroom, but I needed to find a more permanent place as soon as possible. That's when Marie offered a solution. "My sister Anna just finalized her divorce," she said. "She has a beautiful guest room with a small kitchen above her garage. You could rent it for a while, at least until you figure out your next steps." It was an unexpected offer, but one that I appreciated more than I could express. As I packed the last of Linda's belongings, the weight of everything she had done settled over me. Looking at her empty space, I finally allowed myself to say what had been clawing at my mind since the moment the truth came out. "You did everything in your power to destroy our wedding," I muttered under my breath. "And you didn't hesitate to help him do it? Did you really think I would ever marry a woman who treated me so cruelly?" I knew Elliot well enough to understand exactly who he was. And Linda? If she truly believed he was her future, then she deserved him. But one thing was certain. He would cheat on her just as they had both betrayed me. And this time there would be no second chances. Looking back, I can't help but regret all the missed opportunities over the years. But as Linda and I drifted apart, another conversation began to take shape, one that would change everything. That evening Anna and I talked for hours. At some point, our discussion shifted to past relationships, and she opened up about her own painful experience. Her ex-husband had cheated on her, with a colleague no less. When she confronted him, he exploded in anger, physically assaulted her, and then, as if to twist the knife deeper, began openly bragging about his affair. That moment of raw, unapologetic cruelty was what ultimately led to their divorce. Despite everything, they managed to reach an agreement on joint custody of their daughter, Jennifer, who was 10 years old and currently staying with her father. When I shared my own story with Anna, she was completely taken aback. She couldn't believe Linda's reckless, thoughtless behavior, how someone could go to such lengths to sabotage their own future. Anna had her own theory about it. She probably convinced herself that she finally had a real excuse to act on her long-held desire for Elliot, she said. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was the one who fed that idea to her. Maybe he made her believe that you'd never truly leave her, that this was just a game and in the end you'd take her back. I thought about that for a long time, and the more I did, the more it made sense. Linda had always been impulsive, but Elliot? He was calculating. He had always known how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. From the moment I met Anna, I found myself drawn to her. She had this quiet strength, an ability to carry herself with grace despite everything she had been through. When I finally admitted that I could never bring myself to sleep in my old house again, she simply nodded in understanding. Over time, we developed an easy, natural bond, helping each other with small things. She would do my laundry and I, in turn, helped tend to her garden. It wasn't much, but it was comforting. One evening, I decided to do something different. I made a reservation at a popular restaurant known for its live music, thinking it would be a nice change of pace. On my way home, I stopped by a florist and picked out a single red rose, simple but meaningful. When I arrived at Anna's door, I rang the bell, and when she answered, I held out the rose. "I was hoping you'd have dinner with me tonight," I said, smiling. "My turn to treat you." Anna hesitated for a moment, then gave me an apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry," she said gently. "Your visit is a surprise, and I actually have a doctor's appointment tonight." Disappointed but understanding, I nodded. "Of course. Another time then." And with that, I turned to leave, already wondering when I might get another chance. I smiled and asked, "Can we reschedule for another time?" "Of course," Anna replied warmly, leaving the decision up to her. But instead of just setting another date, she made an unexpected announcement. "You're moving in today." There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Without wasting a moment, I began packing my things, and within minutes, we were loading up the car and heading to her house. It felt sudden yet completely right. Later that afternoon, we went to the mall and I picked out 24 red roses for her. It wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a way to mark the beginning of something new, something real. When Jennifer returned home that Sunday evening, she immediately noticed the bouquet in the living room and the smiles we couldn't seem to wipe off our faces. Her eyes lit up with excitement. "So, it's official now, isn't it?" she asked, grinning. Anna and I exchanged a glance before confirming it, and Jennifer beamed with happiness. It was the first time in a long while that everything felt right. Meanwhile, Linda's life took a very different turn. She had no desire to let go of her past, clinging to resentment like a lifeline. When she finally realized how vulnerable she had been, how Elliot had manipulated her, using her as a pawn to get back at me for something I never even did, it was already too late. Strangely enough, Elliot never demanded compensation for the damage done to his car or his broken TV. He simply faded from my life as if our rivalry had never existed. A year after our breakup, Linda met Fred, a bartender with a selfish streak and a mean temper. It didn't take long for them to move in together, settling into his cramped 3-room apartment. But Fred had no interest in children, his own whom he never saw or anyone else's. That included Jennifer and Anna's kids. As for me, life took on a rhythm of its own. Fishing became more than just a hobby, it was my escape. I was always ready to go, no matter the weather, as long as the water wasn't frozen over. It had become a ritual for me, a habit I had formed 6 years earlier when my 2 children left for college. But it was during that time that my family life took a turn for the worse. For years, I had held on to the hope that when the kids grew up and moved out, Marcy and I would finally have time to be together again. I envisioned quiet mornings, shared adventures, and a renewed closeness after years of raising a family. But Marcy had other plans. Instead of rekindling our relationship, she found new hobbies, new friends, and, slowly but surely, a new life that no longer included me. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, that we would find our way back to each other. But as time passed, it became painfully clear, she had already moved on. In contrast, my friendship with Anna deepened. We weren't just sharing a house, we were building something meaningful. And when the storms of life came, we waited them out together, just like we had that day on the lake, huddled under the shelter, fishing rods in hand, waiting for the rain to pass. We finally set off in a small boat heading toward the fishing ponds. Danny was still grumbling under his breath as we pulled away from the dock, but we ignored him. To our surprise, the entire lake was ours for the day. No one else had dared to venture out in such miserable weather. The sky was gray and heavy, the air damp with a bone-chilling cold. Not exactly the ideal fishing conditions, but we were here now, and that was all that mattered. We had only brought beer for the trip, and when Danny spotted the last can sitting at the bottom of the boat, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed it, cracked it open, and downed the rest without a second thought. Despite the lack of rain, the atmosphere felt bleak. The wind howled across the water, making everything feel colder than it was. Still, we sat in that boat, stubbornly drinking what little we had left. At some point, Danny gave me a strange look before twisting open a bottle of water and offering me one as if inviting me to speak. I said nothing, just reached into the cooler, grabbed another bottle and started drinking. My throat was dry, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the nerves tightening in my chest. We sat there for a long while before Danny broke the silence. "Do you remember Hannah Marshall?" he asked suddenly. "She married that trucker from Pakistan. What's his name again?" I nodded, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. "Yeah. Roscoe, wasn't it?" "That's the one," Danny confirmed. "They got hitched about 8 years ago." I narrowed my eyes, trying to understand where he was going with this. "And how exactly does Hannah Marshall fit into your fishing alibi?" Danny scoffed, offended by the implication. "Alibi?" I ignored his indignation and briefly turned on the boat's engine, maneuvering us closer to the shoreline. The waves lapped against the hull, a rhythmic backdrop to my thoughts. Lately, I had found myself increasingly suspicious of Marcy's activities. At first I had tried to brush it off, but something felt off. She had never been particularly tech-savvy, so monitoring her online presence seemed pointless. But her phone? She was constantly on it. I often caught snippets of whispered conversations, but without any way to track her calls, I was left guessing. That's when I decided to take a different approach. I went to the store and purchased 3 digital voice recorders with voice-activated control. If I couldn't track her phone, I could at least listen to what was happening in the house. At first, it was nothing, just meaningless chatter between her and Hannah. But then, last Tuesday, one recording caught my attention. Changed everything. Danny stared at me, waiting for an answer. "Look," I exhaled, my voice steady. "I know Marcy is cheating on me, with Carmen Cambria." Danny's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "But what I don't understand," he said after a long pause, "is why you need an alibi." I had no answer for that, not yet. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. "I made several copies and saved one for you," I said, handing Danny the tape. He fell silent, eyes fixed on the fishing float drifting lazily across the water. The quiet stretched between us, broken only by the gentle lapping of the lake. The lull in traffic on the road nearby made me think. "Why don't I turn it on for you?" I suggested. Danny barely reacted, his focus still on the water. "Simon was fishing with him that day," he muttered. "If there are any questions, Simon will be in Atlantic City until Sunday. If needed, I can provide Carmen with an alibi." I nodded, but his next words made my stomach tighten. "It's time to put an end to this farce. If everything goes according to plan, I'll walk away with $2 million in insurance money, and Terry will be behind bars for a while." I stared at him. "You really think this is the way to handle it?" Danny didn't flinch. "I think we need to act." The tension was cut short when he suddenly stood up and stared at me like I had grown a second head. "I've never heard anything so ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "What now?" I asked. Danny let out a breath. "That's actually a good idea, Terry. We haven't caught any fish yet, might as well make the trip worth it." Without another word, he adjusted his gear. He removed the float, attached a lead sinker to the bottom, and rolled a small ball of porridge onto the hook. With practiced ease, he cast the line, reeled it in until the weight touched the bottom, and within minutes, he had pulled a decent-sized bream into the boat. "All right, buddy," he said, smirking. "We've got your alibi. Let's get out of here before someone calls about your fake tape." As we made our way back, Danny suddenly shifted in his seat, uneasy. After about 20 minutes of driving, his phone rang. "Detective Green?" "What's going on?" he answered, his expression darkening as he listened. A tense silence followed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Damn it," he muttered. "All right, tell me the address. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Keep everyone in the house and don't touch anything unless you have to." He ended the call and leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Do you know how to get to Roscoe and Hannah's place?" he asked, his voice lower now, more serious. 5 minutes passed before he finally turned to me. his expression shifting from frustration to mild amusement. "Stop grinning, you sly jerk," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't funny." But I wasn't grinning because it was funny, I was grinning because I knew, without a doubt, that things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. I stood by, watching as Danny silently observed the ambulance pull away. His expression was tight, unreadable, but I could tell something was bothering him. "Is Roscoe going to be okay?" he finally asked. "Roscoe's fine," I assured him. "That bloody mess in the ambulance? That was Carmen Cambria." Danny shot me a sharp look. "Terry, didn't you say your gun was broken?" "I did," I admitted. "It took me 2 hours to fix it." Danny folded his arms. "And how exactly did you fix it?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "I drilled a hole in the barrel and inserted a bolt to hold it in place. After that, the slide started working again." Danny let out a low whistle. "And how many drill bits did you break?" 4. "Why didn't you just replace the part?" I shrugged. It seemed easier at the time. We made our way inside, where Roscoe was seated at the kitchen table. The ambulance doctor was calmly applying antiseptic to his hands. Though the sting must have been unpleasant, Roscoe barely flinched. He looked up as we approached, his gaze locking onto me. "Terry, is that your gun?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. I exchanged a guilty glance with Danny, unsure how to respond. Finally I sighed. "Yeah, it's mine," I admitted. "But I didn't give it to him. I keep it locked in my nightstand for protection." The ambulance doctor shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "You're lucky you've never had to use it," he remarked. I wasn't sure what had gone down that night, but it was clear things had taken a turn I hadn't expected. 20 minutes later, Danny pulled me aside. "Go home," he told me. I didn't argue. With Marcy not around, I didn't mind being alone. When I got back to the house, I was surprised to find that Marcy had brewed fresh coffee. The aroma still lingered in the air, suggesting she had been expecting company. I poured myself a cup, then another, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I collapsed onto the couch for a much-needed nap. When I woke up at 4 a.m., the familiar drowsiness lingered. Lately, I had been struggling with sleep and it was catching up to me during the day. 5 hours later, just as I was drifting back into a half-sleep, my phone rang. Groggily, I reached for it. "Hello." "Hey Harry, it's Wilbur," the voice on the other end said. "Marcy just called me from." I sat up straighter, my mind suddenly alert. Before Wilbur could finish his sentence, I grabbed my car keys and dialed my son Benson's number. His apartment was in Clarksville, and something told me I needed to get in touch with him, fast. Benson had been stationed at Campbell for the past 2 years, so I called him first. I told him his mother was in trouble but kept the details vague. He clearly had a lot of questions, but I wasn't ready to answer them, not yet. Sharon, on the other hand, reacted very differently. She had been living in Baltimore with her new husband for about a year. When I refused to tell her exactly what was going on, she made it clear that she wasn't going to let it go. A few hours later, she arrived unannounced. The moment she stepped inside, I could tell she was holding back a flood of emotions. Despite everything, the room felt surprisingly warm and familiar, as if for a brief moment things were normal again. She sat beside me on the couch and let out a quiet sigh. "I'm sorry," she said. "You have nothing to apologize for," I reassured her. She hesitated before speaking again. "When I first talked to Mom, she was screaming, saying you were trying to hurt some guy named Carmen. I had no idea who he was." She paused as if piecing everything together. "Turns out he was her lover. I didn't know she'd been cheating on you for over a year." Sharon's expression hardened. "Why is she in jail?" I pretended not to hear her. Before she could press the question, Grandma stepped in to calm her down while Grandpa led me into the kitchen. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, but at that moment, I had no energy left to explain myself. Eventually Sharon sighed. "Why should I support her?" she asked, her voice laced with frustration. We talked for another 10 minutes before she left for Baltimore. I knew the day was far from over, but for now, I let the silence settle. I wasn't particularly hungry, so I just fried an English bun for dinner. As I was pulling it out of the oven, I heard the distant roar of engines. At first I thought it was just a passing group of riders, but the sound kept growing louder. Curious, I walked to the front door and pulled it open. What I saw made me freeze. A convoy of about 30 motorcycles had just pulled up to the house. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the group of bikers that had just pulled up. At the front of the pack, leading the charge, was Roscoe. Without a word, he removed his helmet and handed it to me. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and headed back to his Harley. I didn't hesitate, I followed him. As we approached our destination, 3 men suddenly appeared on the rooftop, flanking a newcomer, Simon Walcott. Even from a distance, it was obvious that Simon was terrified. Despite working at the gym, he was no match for Roscoe, whose strength was in a league of its own. Simon approached us hesitantly, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But before he could utter a single word, Roscoe grabbed him with effortless ease and hurled him off the roof. No hesitation. No words. Just action. 5 minutes later, the 4 of us left the scene, heading home in silence. Roscoe drove me back while the other 3 men continued down the road. When we arrived, I handed his helmet back to him. We exchanged smiles, silent, understanding. Not a single word was spoken, but none were needed. I genuinely appreciated what Roscoe had done for me. For weeks I felt the need to escape, so I made a decision. There was an old boat sitting near my house, one I hadn't used in years. I didn't have the energy to sell it, so I gave it away, freeing myself of the burden. For the next 4 weeks I stayed with Sharon and her family. Every day I made my way down to the harbor, striking up conversations with passing tourists. The routine was simple, but it was exactly what I needed. Meanwhile, Danny kept me updated on what was happening back home. Marcy and Hannah had avoided trial by pleading guilty to multiple charges. Their sentences ranged from 3 to 5 years, an outcome that, in the end, was hardly surprising. As for Simon, the Atlantic City police had no idea where he was, and from what I'd heard, they weren't exactly in a hurry to find him.